Hi, this is Emily from the Navigator Literature team. And for our returning partners especially, we wanted to put together a quick video for you to explain how our team is revising the work of our interim assessments over the summer in preparation for this next school year. We began with a concrete vision for exactly what we're trying to accomplish through these revisions. We knew that this past year we were going to write the best possible tests that we could, but all of those items were being created in a vacuum, having never been given to children, only to adults. So this summer, we really needed to step back on multiple layers of data to take a look at this sounds scary, but it's really not, statistical validity of each item choice and the tests overall, so that we could try to revise in a way that would both make a stronger product to give us better data about what students know and don't know, but also ideally maintain between about 75 and 80% of the same testing materials as last year, so that networks who are in your second year will have year-over-year comparison data. How did students do on question 3 this time this year versus this time last year, which can tell you an interesting and different data set. So we have this vision, and then there's an elaborate step-by-step process for our revisions and bookmarked in a very long series of content, and none of which actually matters, but just know that we are being as thoughtful as we know how to be in making the revisions to these IAs high quality, so that you get as helpful a feedback back to you about what students know and don't know. One of the first things we considered were the passages themselves and the rigor across the 3 tests. Our goal is to have a relatively stable rigor bar across the whole year. Now, it's impossible to have exact rigor test to test, question to question, but we do have lexile ranges for each test and each passage, and we wanted to make sure that we were holding fidelity to that. So in just a few cases, we may have lowered the word count of a particular passage without changing the content of that passage itself. So let's say eliminating 100 words to make it slightly shorter, not 100 words that were crucial to understanding the passage or would change student performance year to year. And we also just checked to make sure that all the lexiles were still in range and appropriate for the grade level being tested, which for the most part, I think with one exception they were, and in the one exception we did lower the lexile by essentially changing the syntax of a few sentences to make them shorter. It was a more purpose-driven process than that, but we'll just leave it at that for simplicity's sake. So once we felt pretty confident that the rigor across the 3 passages and the 4 grade levels built across grade levels in a way that was appropriate, but maintained as close to similar rigor as we could grade to grade. And just for context there, because the nature of ELA is that every standard is always really spiraling, and really it is the complexity of passages that tells us how students are doing in terms of reader, we try to hold that bar relatively stable so that you can see students making growth over the course of the year. It is not an exact science, but we did the best we could. So once we felt confident about passages and their rigor and lexile, we did dive into multiple choice specifically. We used a lot of different data sets to take a look at the multiple choice. So one thing that we did do is we looked at overall program results and individual school program results for our IAs. And you'll note that, for example, the performance on IA2 was a lot more even than on IA3, which suggested that IA3 had something interesting or funky going on, and we needed to pay a little bit more attention to those questions specifically. Again, this is like greatly oversimplified for the sake of putting it into a quick video, but know that we looked at the overall results across the year. We also had some really interesting multiple choice data that we can pull. So 2 multiple choice data that we pulled, normed on, practiced from, is we have from our data reporting the questions ranked most to least difficult. I'm sorry, easiest to most difficult. So, 8th grade IA1, question 8 was the most easy for students. 73% of students all got it correct. Only 26% of students got number 12 correct. We want a range of easy, medium, more challenging questions on a test. It spreads out the data better. If every student got every question right, that wouldn't actually be helpful data to us, because all it would tell us is that we had written an easy test. So we do want to spread. And it's generally okay that some questions have high achievement and some questions have low achievement. But for any question, for example, where there's really less than 50% of students have gotten it correct, it's important to pay really close attention to whether that was a really good question that was challenging and gave us really interesting information about what students may have been tripped up on, or if it was a question where the distractor was too distracting, or there was technically 2 answer choices that might have been correct, things along those lines. So we also want to see this be relatively stable across tests. You'll notice that, for example, 8th grade IA3, there are a bunch of questions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 questions where success rate was above 70%, and only 2 questions on IA1 and IA2, which to me suggested that there were too many easy questions on IA3. And we actually needed to revise for rigor in the more rigorous direction on that particular exam versus 7th grade, which looked a little bit different. Anyway, so we looked at this as a starting point. Then we corroborate with what we call distributions. This tells us how many students, literally number or percent, depending on how you look at it, answered a certain question. So question 1, 551 students picked A, 102 picked D, and so on. In general, you want a staggered distribution that looks like this, though this tells us that this particular question was pretty easy because tons of students got it right. The distractors weren't all too distracting. And this general distribution, in number 4, in number 5, you're seeing this in a bunch of questions. Of course, this is very important. If question 1 answer was D, that would tell you that there was a really big problem with that question because so many students picked A if the answer was really D. So this is a helpful way to think about whether or not a distractor is too distracting, for example. This tells me that this particular question was easy. This tells me that this particular question was slightly more challenging, and so on down the line. You'll see that there are some cases where the data distribution is much closer together. Question 17, essentially the same number of students picked C as picked D. That's when I go to the question, I cross-reference with the where that question fell in the spread. I could also pull individual student data and think about if a student was super high achieving and got this particular question wrong because they chose the distractor, there's probably something wrong with the distractor. But this is a place where we stop and ask ourselves with the quality of the question. Let's say the answer was D. What is it about C that made so many students pick it? Is it telling us something really interesting? Like, oh my gosh, all of these students forgot that the question was about paragraph 6 and the answer for C was about paragraph 5, and they really need to make sure that they're cross-referencing paragraphs. Maybe you keep that question. And then sometimes it's, oh gosh, I could totally see how C would be an appropriate question for students, or an appropriate answer to choose, and it's defensible, so that's a problem. We're going to need to change that. So we did this for every single question on every single test to tweak the language in a couple of cases, again, trying to maintain as much fidelity to year-over-year data as we possibly could. In some cases, we threw out a question entirely and started over. In some cases, we might have tweaked the language of the question stem. In some cases, we might have tweaked the language of the answer choices. Another document we used, we put together a list of question stems that we know of that have been released by PARC, by SBAC, by Tennessee Ready, by the New York State exam, and by what we also wrote on our own tests. And this helped us make sure that the question stems we were asking show up on all different state tests. We can't write a test that is going to be exactly aligned to each of your individual states, but we can make sure that we are pulling stems from every state, or that the way Tennessee, California, New York are asking a question are all relatively similar, so that we are making sure the data is going to give you information about standards aligned performance for students. One of the last things we've done that is still underway as of this current video is we did go back also looking for formatting. We checked directions, we checked how we're writing footnotes, we checked whether or not we're using authors' names or just titles. So that kind of formatting stuff to try to make the tests as professional, as aligned as possible. We did also do some work with standards coding. And this, what it came down to was checking to really think about how we were tagging standards. It can be very tricky in ELA if you're asking a question about character motivation. Innate within that is that you've read the text and could cite the text, for example. So what we made the decision on as a team is that we were going to use the spirit of the anchor standards in the Common Core standards for our coding. So for example, all, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, the way that individual grade level standards manifest in the 0.5 world, the language looks a little different. But the true anchor standard is about the structure of texts, sentences, paragraphs, larger portions of the text as a whole. So then we asked ourselves, is this a question about the structure of the text? Even if that is a little different in how the language is written in 7th grade and in 8th grade, we're going to tag this as a 0.5. Similarly, if anything was to do with interpreting words and phrases, whether a denotative, connotative, figurative meaning, we're going to tag it as a 0.4. So on down the line. So we did a lot of standardizing on our team and pressure testing about how we would code certain questions to make sure that we were aligned. The last thing we did was look at OERs holistically. So how does grade 5 fiction go? How does grade 5 nonfiction go? And then how does it build 5, 6, 7, 8? So we stepped back. In no instance did we actually end up changing the content itself. In some cases, what we ended up doing was tweaking the language. Let's say we're going to use the word develop instead of contribute to, or we are going to take out the parenthetical paragraph reference because we didn't do it in 5th, so we shouldn't do it in 8th. And we also added to everyone's OERs 5 through 8, nonfiction and fiction, just the note to students to use at least 2 details from the text to support their answer. So we made sure that the OER prompts were building purposefully across the year and across the grades. That is a really quick crash course in how our team has been using data to improve upon the IAs for this year. Of course, we welcome feedback on this. We want it to be valuable teaching tools for all of you, and we hope that this year is great in having IAs that give you helpful data about what your students know or in some cases don't know. Thanks.